What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where I, Graham GSM Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network and on Peacock. And today we're talking, finally, about the latest episode of Broken Skull Sessions with Chris Jericho. This is literally almost exactly from 1 month ago, from April 11th, 2021. It dropped WrestleMania Sunday on Peacock, and it took me literally 4 weeks to watch it just because I was there at Mania in Tampa, and it's been a crazy month since then, leading up to it, coming out of it. But I finally got a chance to watch it as I said I would, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The 2 hours flew by, and I will say this, Chris Jericho loves to talk about himself. Other people have said that. I concur. I've seen other interviews with Jericho. I am a Jericho fan, so I was already well aware of that, considering the guy's written, what is he written now? 4 books? Maybe 5? I think he's coming in on 5 with the Complete List of Jericho book, which he does touch upon here in this interview. But I thought this was awesome, if only to see an AEW star on Peacock, on the WWE Network. We never see that. So Jericho, being Chris Jericho, can find a way to work around it. Steve Austin, being Steve Austin, can find a way to work around it. And people have said this probably wouldn't have happened, knowing that the Dynamite rating that Wednesday would be so high, because NXT moved off of Wednesdays that same week. Right, coming out of WrestleMania, NXT moved to Tuesdays, so Dynamite is all on its own on Wednesdays. And it popped a 1.2 million viewer rating that Wednesday, coming out of this interview. Now, I don't know if it entirely had to do with it. I mean, I doubt it, but was it a factor? I'm sure. I'm sure there's people watching this interview on the network or on Peacock that either aren't familiar with AEW, don't watch the product, don't know where Chris Jericho has been. They hear him talking about it, and then they're like, oh, let me check this out. I mean, honestly, it must have been a factor just because, Dynamite has been on its own night for a few weeks now, but they did Blood and Guts last week, no competition, and just barely surpassed 1 million viewers. The first show that was unopposed on that Wednesday did 1.2 million, and there wasn't much more advertised for that show than there was for Blood and Guts, which was a much bigger show. So I'm sure the Jericho interview did play a factor in that ultimately. And I thought it was a great interview, and Steve Austin's interviews are always great here on Broken Skull Sessions, and again, this one was no exception. So let's get into it. Austin and Jericho talk about how the podcast came to be with... They tell 2 different versions of the story, and Austin gives more details. But Jericho texted Steve one time, late last year, coming off the Taker Part 2 interview, saying, hey, great conversation with Taker. And Steve sent him back some emojis. Like a beer emoji, another emoji, whatever. And Jericho called him right then and there. Austin was with his wife, like in bed or whatever. And he's like, I got to go pick up this phone call. Chris never calls me. Jericho owed him a phone call, so he picked it up right then and there. Did Steve. They talked for about an hour, kind of talking shop and shit and stuff like that. And he mentioned on the phone, like, yeah, I'd love to have you on the show, Chris. And Chris was like, I would love to be on the show. And Steve was like, oh, let me see what I can do. Fast forward a few months, Steve asks Vince about it. Vince gave him the thumbs up. I think he didn't say that here. He said that in another interview with Sports Illustrated after the news dropped that this was happening. And that's how it came to be. So it was really, really cool to see these guys on the same forum, to see Jericho on a WWE show for the first time in a few years. And the interview itself was great, but just to see that and that forbidden door, so to speak, being broken down, it's baby steps to see the 2 companies working together. I'm not saying we need to see a full-on super show. That'll never happen, I don't think. But to see stuff like this happen, where we can see AEW talent do WWE shows like on the network and stuff, I think that's pretty cool. I do think they probably won't be doing this again anytime soon, if only because, again, that Dynamite rating was so high that Wednesday, and I have not seen any advertisement for this episode since then, not even on Peacock itself. Like, they never mentioned it on WWE TV or WrestleMania, but they were showing commercials for it on Peacock from what I can recall, and ever since that Dynamite rating came in a few weeks ago, they haven't aired anything. No advertisement for this episode whatsoever. They've promoted the Chronicle with Edge that aired that same weekend, but not the Broken Skull Sessions, which is interesting. If anything, I've only seen promotion for the Randy Orton episode. But anyway, Jericho talks about how he couldn't believe that it could happen, and he also thanks Austin for getting him into podcasting. Because Steve's podcast debuted on Podcast One earlier on in 2013, Jericho's Talk is Jericho show came to be only a few months later. I think it premiered in December of 2013, so it was soon after Steve's, and Jericho said later on in the interview that they were looking for more wrestlers to add to the podcast network because Steve's was so successful, so they asked Jericho, per Steve's request, which is pretty cool. And they've gotten closer over the years. Not that they weren't friends initially when they were in WWE, but they've definitely gotten closer since they've both been, not Jericho's still in the business, but Steve isn't. And they've gotten closer because of that stuff, which is cool. Jericho says, or Steve says rather, that Jericho says himself actually about himself, no surprise there, that he's had a one-of-a-kind career, that he's kind of part of the old school, having started wrestling in the 90s, but he's also still wrestling today, so he kind of gets the best of both worlds. He never thought he would work anywhere else but WWE, but he talked to Tony Khan, and he knew he had something, because you hear all the time, oh, this guy's got money, this guy's interested in starting a promotion, blah, 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 and it never really goes anywhere. But Tony Khan was different, he had the money, and he was a genuine fan, so Jericho knew there was something there to that. And another thing, too, was that all these top stars' contracts, Jericho, Omega, Cody Rhodes, the Bucks, Adam Page, all their contracts were expiring at the exact same time in these various promotions. WWE, Ring of Honor, New Japan. So they were like, I think there's something here. That's 6 stars you can build around. You kind of need 6 stars you can build around. You need that core group of guys you can build around for your company, if that's what you're going to do. And those are 6, not notable names. Jericho's the notable name, and Cody had some equity with the WWE stuff for as long as he was there, but Omega to the U.S. audience, for the most part, to a casual audience, was an unknown. The Bucks, Hangman, were all unknowns. So, but he knew they could go, he knew they were big stars, which was cool. And they also needed TV. TNT provided that. It worked out perfectly. And now fans have choices. They have WWE, they have AEW, they have New Japan, they have all these other different promotions. And they also talk about how Jericho's work in New Japan came to be, because he did a big spike in business for New Japan World when he did that first Omega match 3 years ago at Wrestle Kingdom. What would that have been, 12, I think? Him and Omega, amazing match, and Tony Khan noticed that, and Don Callis has talked about this, Khan has admitted this as well, that was really the catalyst for showing people, wow, there is more to wrestling outside of WWE, and there is an audience there that wants to see this type of stuff. And Jericho has kind of served as that bridge to the newer unknown talent. You'll click on the show to see Chris Jericho, but then you'll stick around to see the Omegas and the Hangmans and the Darbys and the Jungle Boys. You know what I mean? So he's really successfully served as that bridge to this newer talent in Japan and now in AEW. And he did wonder initially, what if it didn't work? Obviously, he wasn't talking about that when AEW launched 2 years ago. He was all gung-ho about it, but what if it didn't work? What if they didn't get TV, or if it fell through, or the pandemic? What if they didn't get the renewal on that TNT deal before the pandemic? Because if it happened during the pandemic or after the pandemic, or not after, but like right now, TNT may not have renewed for another couple of years. So they really got lucky there. So it almost didn't work. But it didn't really matter because it did work, so it doesn't really have to wonder what if it didn't. You know what I mean? And it was always an unknown going to AEW, but that was what was exciting to him, because if he knew he went back to WWE, which was always there for him, he knew what would happen. He knew he would be doing the listing again, he'd be doing the same old song and dance, he'd be, kind of in the same spot on the card, and he also talks about how he was supposed to main event WrestleMania 33, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. He went into more details about that. He was supposed to main event. He didn't. Obviously, that fell through. He was in the second match on the show. That was a big factor as to why he left WWE initially back in 2017. And he came back to do other stuff with them in the years that followed. Like, he came back to do one-offs on SmackDown. He did the Greatest Royal Rumble in 2018. But he wasn't back for full-on run after the Owens stuff in 2017. And he went on to headline the Tokyo Dome 3 straight years in a row, and not the main event. I don't think he was ever the main event, unless I'm mistaken, but him and Omega was a big match, obviously, for the 2017 or the 2018 Tokyo Dome show. 2019, he faced Naito for the Intercontinental Championship and lost. And then last year, a lot of people forget about this because it was right before the pandemic, but he faced Tanahashi and won. So he was involved in 3 big Tokyo Dome shows, wasn't involved in this year's. Will he be back at some point? I would think so. He didn't talk about that here, but if the New Japan relationship continues to grow, then possibly, it would have to be the right match. I'm not really sure who you put him up against. Maybe Will Ospreay, maybe Ibushi. He's already faced Okada, Tanahashi, Naito, the 3 biggest stars they have to offer. So I'm not really sure. Evil as well. I'm not really sure what more matches he could do, aside from Ospreay, maybe, and potentially Ibushi, maybe other ones that I'm not thinking of. But anything below them might be a step down for him in his mind, but whatever. So he also talks about how he also tells Tony what he doesn't want to hear. There's a lot of people like Vince that are going to tell him what he wants to hear. He has to tell Tony Khan, as someone who's been a part of this business for 30 years now, what he doesn't want to hear in order for the show to be successful. Like he was telling someone in an interview recently how with the way that the shows are structured, they were doing too much of like one thing on the same show because the producers wouldn't talk to each other, or agents, or whatever they call them over there. In WWE, they call them producers, but they're agents essentially. That's really the term for it. I guess it really doesn't matter, but he was saying how there would be like a few brawls on the same show. That's because the people weren't fucking talking together. They weren't talking with each other, and that resulted in the same thing happening on multiple segments on the show. So Jericho's been trying to fix that, which is cool. And I appreciate that as a viewer, because the show is far from perfect. I thoroughly enjoyed Dynamite. It has its flaws, and Jericho sees that, and it looks like they're trying to work on that, which is nice. So he goes back to the way beginning, his origin story, which we've heard a million times, but I'll recap it here for the sake of reviewing this podcast. And again, it's a very good story. It's just that we've heard it a million times in a million different interviews. But people thought growing up that he would never become a wrestler. He wanted to be a wrestler and he wanted to be a rock star. He ended up doing both. He started in Stampede Wrestling, went to Mexico. Ultimo Dragon took him to Japan from there. He also admits that he was terrible in high school. And he also talks about how his latest book coming up is going to be documenting every match of his career. Well over 2,000 matches and probably more than that. It was like 2,500 or something like that. From 1990 all the way up until, I would assume, the 30-year mark in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. That's going to be called The Complete List of Jericho. I think it's coming out this spring. I had seen on some website it was coming out in the spring, and it's been spring now for a month and a half, so I don't know what the release date is on that. But back to Mexico, the peso crashed while he was in Mexico, so his earnings went down 60%. He also talks about how he had like 10 different wrestling characters when he was training with his friends on like a mattress outside their house, so he would be ready for wrestling school when that day came. He talks about ECW and how Heyman called him up one time and said, "Hey, can you get to Philly from Calgary?" And he couldn't. He had something else going on, or couldn't make the travel or whatever. So it took him a year from that point to get involved with ECW. He would call up Heyman. He either wouldn't pick up, would dodge his call, or would say that he would call him back, and he never would. And then, it was just like a wild goose chase to get Heyman on the phone. Ultimately, Heyman called him and said, "Hey, I've been trying to get a hold of you for a year now." And Jericho's like, like typical Heyman. But that led him to ECW, and the ECW stuff led him to WCW. And a lot of people realize that, a lot of people don't realize they call him an ECW original. Jericho wasn't there for very long. He said he was only there for 11 weekends, which would equate to around 22 matches in ECW, which is a decent amount, but he wasn't there for like several years. He was only there for like 11 weeks, so that's really about, 4 months or so? Anyway, so he talks about how he learned to hustle from his dad and that mentality of always hustling. He ended up doing an Inoki memorial show or tribute show or something like that. Inoki's not dead, but they were doing Inoki was booking a show. And Jericho ended up on the show in a three-way with Conan and Bam Bam Bigelow. And Bam Bam Bigelow wanted to help put him over and really put in a good word for him because Bischoff was going to be there, which was really cool of him to do. And Bischoff scouted him on that show because Bischoff was there and got him into WCW. And they rewatched the List of 1,000 Holds promo, which was awesome. He talks about, he kind of goes in depth with it, but the long and short of it was that it was Disco Inferno's idea, apparently. And he knew that he had to do whatever it took to stand out on TV. Bischoff even told him when he brought him in that he would be their Shawn Michaels. So Jericho, hearing that, was very surprised when he found out that his first real program or whatever in the company would be with Brad Armstrong. And no disrespect to Brad Armstrong, but he wasn't a top star. He wasn't a Sting. He wasn't a Hogan. He wasn't a Goldberg, And Jericho admits here that he always felt that WCW could have done more with the cruiserweights because they had a lot of talented people in that cruiserweight division that obviously went on to do bigger and better things in WWE. But Jericho, Eddie, Benoit, Ray, all four guys that went on to become multi-time world champions for the most part in WWE. And he felt that Eddie Guerrero, a heel Eddie, would have been a perfect foil for a babyface Sting. And Jericho tried to make that transition into the heavyweight division and do more with the heavyweight guys. It didn't work. They show him making the Goldberg-inspired entrance at Fall Brawl 1998, and that was when he, not there specifically, but he talks about meeting Ralphus and adding him to his act. At that point, he always wanted to work for Vince, but he knew he was on his way out when he called out Goldberg, but Goldberg didn't want to do the match. He called out Goldberg on the show as a character, and Goldberg, in real life, just didn't want to do the match. And he said that it would have been the greatest squash of all time. And it should have been on pay-per-view, but they wanted to do it on Nitro, have Goldberg beat him in a second, and just have it be over with. But Jericho wouldn't really gain anything from that. So he went 7 months without signing a contract. Bischoff got to a point where he realized his contract was coming up, and he wanted to re-sign him. They had a verbal deal worked out initially, but Bischoff never really got around to offering the contract. So he knew at that point he wasn't a priority. And he knew at that point, listen, I'm definitely leaving. So instead of doing jobs on the way out, which is what he wanted to do, and he was going to make the most out of whatever, like if it was a losing streak, he would have made a t-shirt saying like, oh, Jericho, 0-12, blah, blah, blah. Instead, they just took him off the TV because they probably had a good idea that he was headed to WWE, didn't want to boost his stock anymore. So Bischoff, from a business standpoint, probably did the best thing that he could, knowing that Jericho was on the way out. So he met with Vince, did Jericho, while he was under contract at WCW. He went to Vince's house in Stamford, and they were having a booking meeting while he was there. Again, anyone who has heard Jericho talk about his career or read his books, this is old news, but it's still entertaining to hear about. He talks about eating brownies with Vince, and Vince showed him the entire house, and Jericho's like, why is she showing me this? Like, why would he show me this entire house and, have me in on the booking meetings while I'm still at WCW? And Vince's excuse years later was that, I wanted to see if I could trust you. Either way, Jericho felt like he outgrew WCW when he talks about the origin of the countdown clock, being at like the mailroom and seeing the clock to the new millennium, and he's like, that would be a good idea for a wrestler. That would be a good idea for a debuting wrestler. That would be a good idea for me as a debut in WWE. And how it was, the plan was always for the clock to expire at the beginning of the show that night in August of '99 on Raw. It was Vince's idea, McMahon, not Russo, for the clock to expire in the middle of the show during a Rock promo, which is very smart. And he said, which I didn't know, only Rock, Vince Russo, and Jericho knew about that promo. Not even Vince, apparently. They rewatched that iconic WWE debut, relived the pop and how loud it was. It still stands the test of time to this day. And it probably is the greatest debut in WWE history, aside from Kane's a few years earlier in '97 at Bad Blood. He knew going into it that he had to hit a home run in his first appearance on the show. And he got a lot of heat for that promo coming out of it too from people in the back, like the wrestlers, because he was like calling them boring and the ratings stagnant. He's coming in from an opposing company, and he was the first one to really do that aside from Big Show and Sean Waltman as well. So he was like the first real big, not detraction, but like what's that word when someone goes from one place to another? Whatever the word is, he was like one of the first real big stars to do that. Again, Sean Waltman and Chris Jericho, our Big Show as well. But Jericho's was really a big, big deal. So he had a lot of heat for that promo coming out of it, he said, from people in the back. He said that the pose that I don't think does anymore, but that he used to do with his hands up in the air, doing the whole Y2J thing. He got that from Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson would do that sometimes at concerts, and he would have his back to the audience for like 5 minutes, and they'd be going crazy. Because they knew it was Michael, but they were just going crazy to see him turn around, which is cool. He grades it an 8 out of 10 in retrospect. Not Michael Jackson's concert, but his own debut. And it was a 10 out of 10 for how great of a debut it was, but there are some things the Jericho of today would have done differently 20, 25 years ago, at this point, 22 years ago, whatever. They also rewatch him beating Triple H for the WWE Championship on Raw, and that was the night where he beat Triple H for the title, but he had it immediately taken away from him. Just a great moment, though. But he also, to kind of backtrack a little bit, he talks about how he wanted to quit the company. After a match with Viscera on Heat, which he called a very good match because Viscera's a big guy, they had a good match, but he knew he wasn't doing shit in the company. He was only there for a couple of months, wasn't making an impact. His stock had just completely soured, had completely just, taken a turn for the worse in the company. Taken a spiral downward. So he knew that he had to leave. He knew that he wanted to quit. So when he went to Brian Gewirtz, one of the head WWE writers at that point, he told him, listen, I got to go talk to Vince. And Brian's like, well, you want to find out what you're doing tonight first? And he's like, well, I got to quit. It doesn't really matter. And then Brian was like, well, you're winning the championship. And then Jericho said, Well, can you tell me more about that? So obviously that piqued his interest. And they didn't do that because he was quitting. I think they were just going to do that anyway as part of the plan. So it was a great match. He gives Triple H credit for it being a great match. And they didn't really work. They weren't great friends at that point, were Triple H and Chris Jericho. But he does respect him as a worker. And they just had great chemistry in the ring. So he said that he would have been content with being champion if only briefly. I mean, it wasn't an official reign, but he got to hold that championship for a very brief period. But Vince even told him afterward that, hey, don't worry, you'll have it again someday. And it was at that point that he finally felt like he got out of his WCW funk and really started to adapt to the WWE style and the WWE audience. He also recalls saying fucking in a promo. After the show went off the air, it was a SmackDown, I think in April of 2000. He dropped an F-bomb after the show went off the air, and he accidentally brought it to Vince's attention backstage when Vince gave him, like, the stamp of approval with a hug. And he was like, oh, you didn't hear my promo? He's like, what did you say? And then Vince found out about it that way. So Jericho is to blame for that one, which was funny. They also rewatched Jericho becoming WCW champ, WWE champ. The 2 wins that he had over Rock and Austin at Vengeance. It was Vengeance, wasn't it? 2000 when he became undisputed champion. And he didn't know he was winning the championship until that day. He talked about how people always ask him, oh, why wasn't your dad there? Why wasn't your mom there? Why wasn't your wife there? Or girlfriend, blah, 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 at that point. He said because he didn't know that he was winning the championship until that day. And he found out actually in catering when he was eating food and Vince talking loudly as he does, was talking to Taker and said, oh, you know the business is going downhill when you put the championship on Jericho. Ha, ha, ha. And he actually did put the championship on Jericho later that day. And Vince sounds like an absolute ball buster. So that seeing or hearing that he said that, knowing that he said that really doesn't surprise me. But anyway, I guess Austin, there was so much interference and just so many shenanigans and so much bullshit going into the finish of that match that Austin even told Jericho, listen, just call the finish out there because it was so convoluted. And he got beat a lot going into the pay-per-view. I mean, he was booked to look like a complete loser. So the fact that he would win the championship that night, 1, is typical WWE booking. But 2, it didn't surprise anyone when there was like 3 different interference spots in both matches because Jericho was not credible from a performer standpoint. I mean, as a performer, he was great, but like from a booking standpoint, he had no credibility because he had been beaten so often going into that pay-per-view. He talked about how there was no celebration when he went backstage because everyone had already left the building at that point. So he walked through the curtain, no one was there. I don't even know if Vince was there at that point. But he had his own little celebration later that night or the next night or whatever when he got back to his hotel and ordered a pizza. He stopped by a pizza place. They stopped serving at 12. It was 11:55, but they already stopped serving. So he got back to his hotel and asked the concierge or the guy that works the front desk where the best place to get a pizza was. And he remembers the guy's name, which is really funny. And the guy was like, oh, get Domino's, whatever. So he went back up to his room. He found out from Domino's that you can't get it delivered to the room. He has to come downstairs. So he picks up the pizza. He gets locked out of his room. Goes back downstairs, and the concierge guy, who he just checked in with like a half an hour earlier, needed verification that it was his room, even though he was just there. The guy had just seen him check in. He already forgot his, key or whatever. And the guy didn't believe him. So he was giving Jericho a hard time. He had to go into the room, and he asked him, when I walk in here, what am I going to see? And Jericho's like, you're going to see 2 championship belts because I'm the friggin' United States champion, or the friggin' undisputed champion. You're going to see those 2 belts laying on the bed. Guy got him in, brings the pizza in the room, and as soon as Jericho sits down on the bed, the pizza falls off, face first on the ground. So Jericho had to enjoy a half-cold pizza and a dusty half-cold pizza on the night that he won the undisputed championship, which is just it was a great story. Again, I've heard it a million times, but it's always entertaining. So anyway, they talk about the WrestleMania 19 match that he had with Chris Jericho, or that Chris Jericho had with Shawn Michaels, which was just an awesome match. And Jericho thought he should win. But it was Pat Patterson who said, you don't have to win. You could just get heat afterward if you low blow Shawn Michaels after the match. And that was Pat's idea. So they had a great match. Jericho came up with the ending. Shawn came up with the beginning. They had nothing for the middle. So they came up with everything, I think, within 10 minutes of rehearsal for WrestleMania that day. And it ended up being just an amazing match. And Vince wanted to do the match at Mania after their interaction on the highlight reel a few months earlier. And Jericho really, really wanted that match. Because his top 3 wrestlers of all time were Shawn Michaels, Owen Hart, and Ricky Steamboat. 2 of which he's been able to work with. He may have had a match with Owen Hart before he passed. I don't think so. I think that was someone else. I think Edge had a match with Owen or something before he passed. I don't think Jericho ever got to face Owen. But he has faced Ricky and did get a chance to face Ricky and Shawn in WWE, which is really cool, including Shawn. Actually, both of them at WrestleMania. WrestleMania 19 and then WrestleMania 25. And then Ricky on his own at Backlash 09, which was a great match. So anyway, they watched the match, and it was such a great match, and it went well. From there, he talks about leaving WWE in 05. He needed to know that he was in the main event mix. Or not in the main event mix, but at least that they were doing something with him. They weren't. They had no plans for him. So we knew it was time to go in 2005. He felt burnout at that point, and he didn't love it anymore. It was like pizza. You love pizza. You eat it, you eat it, you eat it. You don't really like it anymore until a couple of years later you try it, and then you do again. That was what wrestling was to him at that point in time. Vince even told him at that point that he wished sometimes that he could take a break. And I guess Vince obviously would never say that type of thing. And he said it to Jericho because it's true. Everyone needs a break at some point. So they agreed to have his last match at SummerSlam against Cena. And Jericho even asked him, do you want me to do a loser leaves town match? Or is this it? Because my contract expires that day. So this is it. Tell me. And Vince was like, oh, no, we're fine. We'll just have you lose and that's it. Sure enough, a week before the pay-per-view, Howard Finkel, doing the dirty work for Vince, calls up Jericho and says, oh, can we have you for Raw and for SmackDown? Here's your travel. And Jericho was like, I'm not doing it. So Vince ends up calling him, giving him this angry call soon after, saying, oh, you don't want to do the job on the way out? You got this kayfabe deal over in Japan? Or whatever it was. And Jericho's like, what are you talking about? Like, we just went over this. We went over this a little while ago where I said I would do whatever you wanted me to do, but you said you didn't need me for a loser leaves town match or for Raw, so we agreed on SummerSlam. So they ended up working it out. Vince got his way, per usual, with Jericho working the loser gets fired match on Raw the next night. I don't know if it was a loser gets fired match, because I don't know if Cena would have gotten fired if he lost. I don't think so. I think it was just if Jericho lost, he would have gotten fired. But it was for Cena's WWE Championship. They worked well together, had some great matches. Jericho lost. And the send-off was inspired by Die Hard, where he got carried off, and it's like Hans Gruber when he's like, no, I don't want to die, blah, 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 before he gets killed. That was where Jericho got like the being carried off bit from when he got fired by Bischoff, blah, blah, blah. And he, at that point, didn't know if he would ever be back. He talked about doing comedy and how he learned to commit to a character from doing improv when he left WWE. But then he watched John Cena versus Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 23. Always loved working with John. Has always loved Shawn, obviously. So he wanted to watch the match and fell in love with it all over again. It was a great match. I don't know if he saw the Raw match soon after, but that was even better than the Mania match. But he got jealous watching that match, and he felt like he was ready to come back. Now, he didn't talk about the Benoit stuff here. Benoit does not get mentioned. But I think that was a factor, too, because Benoit, that was right before Benoit died, and obviously he was really close with Benoit. And then the Benoit stuff happened, and I don't know if that turned him off to coming back to wrestling, or that was why it was delayed. I don't remember. But that was a factor, too, that he talked about in his book. He just doesn't, he doesn't talk about it here for obvious reasons, because it's fucking Peacock. So he felt like initially when he came back in late 07, he felt like a nostalgia act, because he was doing the same song and dance, just with a different haircut. Don Callis, he name drops Don Callis a lot on this episode, which is cool. Don Callis even asked him, are you going to wear hair extensions? And Jericho said, why would I do that? And Don said, well, that's the Jericho of old, right? Like, you would wear hair extensions. So he was doing all the old Y2J stuff, and it wasn't really resonating with the audience. So he knew he had to reinvent himself, which he did. Dropped the Y2J stuff completely, reinvented his look. He was inspired by Nick Bockwinkel from his AWA days, which WWE just put a DVD out about back in 08 when he started doing the character, doing the big words and wearing the suits and stuff like that. And he would take his time with his promos, inspired by Javier Bardem from No Country for Old Men, which is really cool. So they rewatched the No Mercy 08 ladder match, which on the graphic it says December of 08, which is not true. It's not December 5th. It was October 5th, but I mean, that's merely nitpicking, which was an amazing match. He calls it his favorite match. Now, keep that in mind, because the Omega match later on he says was his best match. I assume there's a difference there, but he calls this his favorite match of all time. And he loved the creativity that went into it. And he talked about like the feud itself and how Jericho and Shawn had a one-off at Judgment Day 08 and how they had nothing going on post that match. So they're like, why don't we do something together, So again, he completely reinvented himself, and it was an amazing program. They talk about the debut of the list and how the list came to be, and he rewatched that and how he worked on his promos with former WWE creative writer Jimmy Jacobs, now I think he's still with Impact. I haven't seen him in a little bit, but pretty sure he's still with Impact. He was adamant at that point about getting anything and everything over, whether it was a friggin' pen, a list, the word "it" he got over. Anything he touched was money at that point. And he said confidence is key. If you can commit to anything, then it's going to get over. Even like the phrase "stupid idiots" that he started using back in 2016. Vince even told him he was the only person that could get that over. It was so ridiculous, but it only worked for Jericho because he was so committed to making it work. He found that he had great chemistry with Kevin Owens after they teamed up one time on SmackDown in England, where Owens called him the GOAT, and then Jericho called him, what did he say? Not the bear. He said, I forgot what he called him. He's like, oh, and you're the something. And then Owens is like, yeah, whatever, Canada. Just amazing. And Jericho's like, man, this guy's funny. So they rewatched the Festival of Friendship, or at least highlights from it, and Jericho calls it a David Lee Roth video mixed with the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones. That was the idea behind it. And he wanted fans to see that betrayal coming a few seconds beforehand, because if he just gets betrayed out of nowhere, then he doesn't have that fear. Like when Jason kills someone in the Friday the 13th movie, you don't have that fear sometimes when he just chops someone's head off from behind because they don't know it's coming. But if they know Jason's coming, it's like, oh, they're begging for their life. And Jericho had that moment of like, oh man, he's going to turn on me a few seconds before he actually did. Triple H wanted to change it. He does not name Triple H here, but he has said in several other places doing other interviews that Triple H wanted to change the Festival of Friendship because he didn't think it would work. He had already agreed on what it would be, Jericho did, with Vince, but Vince wasn't there that day. So we went to Vince about it, and Vince was like, yeah, do it as we discussed. And he showed that to Triple H. He showed him the text, and Triple H was like, yeah, fine, whatever. And I don't know if he said this here, but Triple H even said to him afterward, yeah, you're right, it worked. So it ended up going amazingly well. It was supposed to be Jericho and Owens for the Universal Championship at WrestleMania 33. When that segment happened, Jericho was the United States Champion, and Owens was the Universal Champion. By that point, I assume they had already had their plans planned out, because by the time the Festival of Friendship came to be, because it was like that Sunday or a few Sundays later that Owens lost the Universal Championship to Goldberg. I don't think there was ever an outcome where Goldberg was losing to freaking Kevin Owens. So as soon as they booked that match, it became pretty obvious that Owens was not going to be champion of WrestleMania. What would have happened with Jericho's United States Championship, I don't know. He probably would have lost it to Sami Zayn or someone like that. So it was supposed to be Jericho and Owens for the Championship of Mania, Universal Championship, with Jericho winning the championship as a face for the first time in his career. Jericho has never won a world champion. He has never been a world champion as a babyface before. Not in WWE, not even in AEW. He won that championship as a heel as well. So the original idea was that he would win the championship of Mania, and Brock Lesnar would come back and beat Jericho for the championship at the next pay-per-view in April. Jericho would ride off into the sunset, and then that would be it. And then Brock would be champion. So Brock was always going to get the belt no matter what. I don't know why they didn't think... would they have done Brock and Goldberg at Mania without the championship? Yeah, probably, but he makes it sound like Brock would have come back and won the championship, and Brock would not have been a part of WrestleMania that year, which I don't believe for a second. Because I think the plan was actually supposed to do Shane and Brock. So I don't think Brock would have never been around. I think he just would have been around and then won the championship. But that would have been fine. But then Goldberg came back. He got really hot, and Goldberg and Lesnar was a bigger attraction on paper to casual audiences than Jericho and Owens, even though Owens and Jericho was one of the best stories going into that show. So he understood them taking the championship off of Owens, putting it on Goldberg instead, giving that match the championship. From a business standpoint, he understood it. He was fine with it. He feels like Owens and Jericho would have drawn, or Lesnar and Jericho, he feels like it would have been a draw. It still could be a draw. I don't think we'll ever see that match. I don't really have a desire to see that match in 2021, but he feels like it could still be a draw. Not only did they take the Universal Championship out of the Jericho-Owens match, it still could have been a pretty prominent match in the show later on in the show. They put it on the second match on the show. It did make for a great first hour of WrestleMania 33. I was there. I loved the match. Obviously, Vince didn't because he gave Owens shit about it afterward. But, they didn't have to put it on second. If anything, he just would have preferred to be on first, which went to AJ and Shane, which was a great spot for AJ to be in. I'm sure he was happy about that. But Jericho was not happy about being on second and not on first or in the main event or in the second half of the show or whatever. And he didn't want to be the guy that would always be there just being used and doing whatever. So again, he felt like it was time to go. He says that he loves working with WWE. He loves working with Vince. They had a great relationship. He even brings up how he remembers drinking with Vince on a flight home one night a couple of years ago, like when he was 71, so probably about like 5 years ago at this point. And they flew in at like 4 or 5 in the morning, and then Jericho's like, oh, I'm going to bed. I got to do press at 7, whatever, so I'm just going to go back and get 2 hours of sleep. Vince was like, oh, do you want to go to the gym? It's like, you're a crazy man. So Jericho's like, no, I'm sleeping. And then Vince was like, I don't care. I have to get up at 6:30 for work. Vince didn't give a shit. Jericho went back to his hotel, called Vince crazy, and went to bed. Wakes up to a text from Vince with a picture of Vince posing in the gym. So he just went from drinking all night on this plane ride. He was plastered probably. Not plastered, but, he was a little bit intoxicated. Went to the gym and then worked out until he had to work at 6:30. The guy is a fucking crazy man, is Vince McMahon, which is probably why he looks like what he does today. Because the guy never gets any goddamn sleep. He doesn't take care of himself. At least physically he does, but in terms of like sleeping and getting actual rest, he does not. He works his body to friggin' death. So, anyway, he always knew that he could do more, Jericho did, if he was in WWE. So then Callis asked him, he called him about the possibility of a Jericho-Omega match. Jericho had heard of Omega before. I think the Omega was even on his podcast in early 2017, coming off the Omega-Okada match at Wrestle Kingdom. So he knew of Omega, knew he was a big draw, didn't really watch the New Japan product, but they worked out a great deal for him to go to New Japan, do the match for the IWGP United States Heavyweight Championship. And after it was worked out, he went to Vince about it. And Vince was like, oh yeah, absolutely. Everyone knows that you're a WWE guy, so it's going to be good exposure for us, blah, blah, blah. It did big business. And he calls it the best match he ever had, which again, earlier he said the Michaels match of No Mercy 08 was his favorite match. So I assume there's a difference there. I know Meltzer gave the Omega match 5, 6 stars or whatever the fuck it was. So maybe critically he might mean it was his best match. And I'm sure it is between the two. What's the better match? Omega Jericho or Jericho Michaels? I still say Michaels and Jericho just because, Omega and Jericho might have been a better match technically. But like Shawn and Jericho was an amazing match and it had a great story behind it. Omega and Jericho had a good story too. But it wasn't built up for 6-7 months. You know what I mean? Like there was a different story attached to that one. So he talks about the origin of the Painmaker character, kind of a play off of Okada. That who he faced, I think, was it later that year? I think he faced Okada later on. No, I think they did that match in 2019. Either way, he was doing like the Painmaker makeup and shit like that. And it was at that point that wrestling became fun for him again. So at New Year's Dash, the next day after Wrestle Kingdom, he attacked Naito. And the idea was not to set up a match necessarily. I mean, if he came back, he would. But if he didn't, at least he had his heat on the way out. A lot like the Shawn Michaels shit from WrestleMania 19. Vince asked him, I thought it was just a one-off. And he's like, well, it was, but I don't know. I mean, I have a certain price point for if I was to come back, this is what it would be. So they eventually agreed to the Naito match, doing the rematch, putting the Intercontinental Championship on Jericho, which he won that summer from Naito. He was advertised for that Saudi show, the first ever Saudi show they did, Greatest Royal Rumble in April of 2018 against The Undertaker. And the match got changed to Taker and Rusev, which is true, but it's not true. Because he makes it sound like, when Vince found out about the New Japan stuff, that was when they switched it. He even said that Vince's excuse was that the Prince of Saudi Arabia or whatever wanted the original Rusev and Taker match. What Jericho doesn't mention here was that the original plan was not Jericho and Taker. Jericho was supposed to be in the Battle Royal, which he was ultimately in the Rumble. But Rusev was always supposed to face Taker. It changed to Jericho and Taker. And Rusev talked about this on Talk is Jericho, because I think there was heat on Rusev or whatever. And then they changed it back to Taker and Rusev. It was a very weird change of events. It was very bizarre. So I do think it was more. I do think it had less to do than the with the New Japan stuff, and more to do with the Rusev shit. I don't know, and probably the Prince stuff too. Because Jericho, it wasn't like he was pulled from the show. Again, he doesn't mention this. He was still on the pay-per-view. He was still in Saudi. It's his last WWE match. It was the fucking greatest Royal Rumble. What a way to go out, So anyway, he had talked to Tony Khan and about doing AEW, and that's how he got involved with that. He talks about working through the pandemic and having no real barometer. He mentions Orange Cassidy here. There's a lot of name drops. A lot of name drops of people in Japan and Impact now and fucking AEW, obviously. But he doesn't know what, or at least when this thing first started, he didn't know what worked and what didn't, because there was no audience. How do you know if you're selling for too long or if this promo was good? Because there's no one there. They have more fans now, obviously, but initially for the first, 6 months, they didn't. And it is cliche to say, but all the companies are happy to put smiles on people's faces, he says. And Steve praises his run, not just this recent run in AEW, but his overall run in wrestling. And that was when they showed a picture of Jericho with the AEW World Championship on the side, which was just surreal to see. Jericho thanks WWE and Vince for this opportunity to be on Broken Skull Sessions, to be on Peacock. He still feels good today, doesn't know when he's going to wind it up or hang up the boots. He's 50 now, but as long as he's going out there having fun, still feels good, and doesn't become a parody of himself, then he's going to continue to do it. I would say he is closer, a lot closer to the end of his career than the beginning, of course. He'll probably be done, if I had to take a guess, within the next 5 years. And even that might be stretching. I mean, the guy's 50. I mean, he's not going to be wrestling, I don't think, until he's 60. At least not at the level he is now. And even now, it's pretty obvious he's not, the same in the ring that he was even 10 years ago. But he's still doing great work, I think, overall. And he's coming off a Blood and Guts main event on Wednesday, which was a very good match. And he's still doing great character work, too, with some awesome promos. So can't really fault him for that. For all the issues that Jericho seemingly has outside of the ring, for all the shit that he was involved in 2020 and early 2021. I won't get into it here. For all that shit, not behind the scenes, but like on a personal level that everyone has an opinion on. In the ring, he is undoubtedly one of the greatest of all time. I don't really think that can be disputed. And he talks about how he's still busy with his band, he's still busy with his podcast, he's still doing stuff. Even when he is done wrestling, he'll still have a lot of stuff to keep him busy with. And then he and Steve toast, and that was the end of it. So, great interview here. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Him and Steve have awesome chemistry. Jericho has a lot of great stories to share. Like I said, a lot of which I've heard before. Even the AEW stuff, he's talked about it on his own podcast. But I guess just to hear it on a WWE show is amazing. I think it might be... Hopefully we get to see more of this type of stuff in the future, where they welcome on people that aren't even with WWE currently, or aren't a part of like the Legends deal and shit like that. Like a CM Punk, for example, I think would be fucking sick, because he's not involved with WWE at all. And I don't know, it would be a lot like a StarCast interview that he did with Mike Johnson a few years ago, where it's not, it's on WWE's network, but it's not like he's coming back for a match. I think that'd be fucking cool. I think Punk should be the next guest they have on the show. Not the next guest. I think the next guest is going to be Godfather, and I assume that's coming out soon. I had seen a picture that Charles Wright put up on his Instagram announcing that he'd be the next guest on the show, which is cool. But Punk at some point I think would be amazing, especially as we come close to the 10-year anniversary of his Pipe Bomb promo. Him in Austin would be fucking money. That's just me. I don't think Punk would ever do it, but that's just my opinion. But anyway, this was great stuff. Definitely check it out on the WWE Network. It clocks in over 2 hours, but like I said, the time just absolutely flies by. I think the only other episode that was longer than this was the 2 Taker episodes. Flair, I think, was over 2 hours too. But again, it's Ric Flair, so I'm not really surprised. This was one of the better ones in recent memory, in that saying something, because there's been a lot of good ones. But I thoroughly enjoy this, so definitely make time for it when you get a chance. Thank you guys for checking out my review. Again, I apologize for it being so late. It's been about a month now, but better late than never. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. And I am going to be getting to my review of the WWE 24 on The Miz, I think within the week. I got to watch it today, and I'll probably review it this week. More videos to come this coming week, including another huge exclusive interview, so keep an eye out for that as well. Have an awesome one, guys. Enjoy the rest of your week. I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.